Now, this is mainly a question for those who are joining in online, because I've asked this question in the hall before and I know the answer already. Those in the hall have already given up on New Year's resolutions, because I've asked you that on a New Year before. Anybody made any New Year's resolutions this year? No? There we go. See, they've all given up on it. And I wonder if it's because that you've had that relationship with New Year's resolutions that we've just seen on the screen. You know, we start with great intentions, and then we fail, and so we reduce those intentions a little bit, and we fail again, and then we reduce them again, and we fail again, and then we give up altogether. But a new year is very often a time for new you. You might not make New Year's resolutions, but we kind of start each new year with a blank sheet of paper, and we perhaps at least have some intentions, even if we don't call them New Year's resolutions. We're certainly invited to think that way. We're certainly encouraged to think that way. If you watch adverts on the television, there comes a stage, and I think it might be Christmas Day, there comes a stage when all the adverts change from toys, food, drink, Coca-Cola, and all of that kind of stuff, to Boxing Day sales, holidays. You know that you've got through Christmas when you start to see the holiday adverts. Weight Watchers, Slimming World, gyms, David Lloyd leisure clubs. Other leisure clubs are available, of course. And now we're even encouraged to take up veganuary, when we don't eat meat and we just eat plants. Or we stop drinking and we have dry January. I won't ask you if anybody in the hall if they're going through dry January. I hope we all are. And February, March and April and so on as well. But we start off the new year with probably some kind of new intentions to be a new you in 2022. And at the risk of jumping on the advert bandwagon, the new series that we're starting with today is called Leading a Healthy Lifestyle. Now, I'm not talking about physically. I don't feel that I'm the sort of person who can stand up here and talk about our physical lifestyle, but I'm talking more about our emotional lifestyle, our spiritual lifestyle. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, why do we need to talk about this? Let me just give you one example. Some of you may have heard of the person called Mark Driscoll. Anybody heard of Mark Driscoll? He's a very famous American pastor. He's very well regarded amongst evangelical churches. He was a council member of the Gospel Coalition, regularly invited to speak at Christian conferences around the world, including in this country. But in 2014, he was forced to resign as pastor of Mars Hill Church in Seattle. And around that time and since, a large number of present and former church leaders have lodged complaints against him, talking about him creating a climate of fear in his church, of using verbally abusive language, of a lack of self-control, of being arrogant and having a domineering attitude. Now, I bring that up as an example, not because I want to shame Mark Driscoll in any way, but his story is such an important example of Christian leadership that's gone wrong that 7 years later, so last year, the Christian magazine Christianity Today began a podcast series called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, looking at Mark Driscoll, looking at the kind of the culture around him and at Mars Hill Church, and trying to learn the lessons from what happened to him. And I tell you this story because if we're not careful, we could fall into the same pattern. Not that we would necessarily do exactly the things that Mark Driscoll has done, because Mark Driscoll, it has to be said, is like Marmite. You either love him or hate him. And it's very easy to dismiss his problems as a one-off. But the sad truth is this. Sometimes there is not much difference in the emotional and relational maturity of Christians and Christian leaders and the rest of the world. Sometimes there's not much difference in the emotional and relational maturity between Christians and the rest of the world. Let me try and show you what I mean. I wonder if these questions or these statements remind you of anyone you know. If they do, don't look at them. And I want to say right at the beginning that this isn't a dig at anyone personally. I've actually adapted these statements from the book Emotionally Healthy Church by Pete Scazzero. So he was the one who put these statements together. I've just kind of made Salvation Army'd them, if that's such a word, to make them more real to us. So how about an officer who never says, "I was wrong," or "sorry"? Or a local officer who constantly criticises other people? Maybe the high control volunteer who can't accept other people's point of view. Maybe the husband who's busy serving in the Corps, unaware of his wife's loneliness at home. Perhaps a musician who interprets any suggestion as a personal attack on their musicianship or personal rejection of some sort. The local officer who struggles with their feelings of bitterness and resentment towards the officer, but they're afraid to say anything to them. The exemplary soldier or adherent who tirelessly volunteers in 4 different ministries in the Corps, but rarely takes personal time to take care of themselves. Maybe the member of the congregation who's never transparent about their struggles or their difficulties. Do any of those ring true? I have to say I see myself in some of them at some of the time. Pete Scazzero concludes this. Many Christians are supposedly spiritually mature, but remain infants, children, or teenagers emotionally. They demonstrate little ability to process anger, sadness, or hurt. They whine, complain, distance themselves, blame, and use sarcasm like little children when they don't get their way. Highly defensive to criticism or differences of opinion, they expect to be taken care of and often treat people as objects to meet their needs. Why would that be the case? After all, most Christians have received some training in worship, what to do when you come to worship, or how to worship God, in prayer, in Bible study, even how to talk to someone else about Jesus. But we have to admit that the church doesn't often train Christians in things like how to look beneath the surface of their lives to see what's really going on, how to break the power of their past and the way that it influences their present, how to live in brokenness and vulnerability, because we all have that to a certain extent, how to know our limits, how to embrace grief and loss, how to make Jesus their model for loving well, how to slow down in order to lead with integrity. The church hasn't always been so good at training those things. So that's the sort of thing that we're going to be exploring through this series, Leading a Healthy Lifestyle. How to keep ourselves both emotionally and spiritually fit. Oh, that's obviously interested Siri, if nobody else. So we're going to be looking about how to keep emotionally and spiritually fit. But through the passage that we read together a little bit earlier on, Jesus has a question to ask us first. If you've got your Bibles, you might want to turn back to John chapter 5, verses 1 to 15. John chapter 5, verses 1 to 15. We come upon this scene at the pool of Bethesda. Maybe you can imagine it in your mind's eye. Jesus walking through the sheep gate, perhaps, towards the pool of Bethesda and the 5 covered porches. And this is what he discovers. Verse 3 says, crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches. You could translate that verse 3, as a great number of disabled people. Not just a few, but hundreds of them, all sick Many in those days with undiagnosed illnesses that perhaps we would be able to diagnose today but couldn't be diagnosed at that time. Some of them so feverish that they had to hide from the sun and stay in the shade. It tells us about the blind, those who were born blind and those who had become blind through illness. It talks about the withered, the lame. Pastor Kent Hughes draws it all together like this. What a pitiful crowd of broken humanity, he says. It doesn't take much imagination to see those withered, wasted bodies, to smell the stench, to see the filth, and to sense the pathos of the old and young among that impotent, suffering humanity. Here is hundreds of people gathered together, suffering in so many different ways. And Jesus comes into this scene and he approaches a man who we are told has been ill for 38 years, probably for most of his life then. And he asks him a question, and this is the question he asks him. Do you want to get well? What? Do you want to get well? I don't know much about this Jesus, but he seems a bit thick to me. That's a question to ask somebody who's been ill for 38 years, isn't it? Do you want to get well? Of course I want to get well. I've been sick for most of my life. Of course I want to get well. Maybe the sun has got to Jesus' head. Maybe that's the reason. Do you want to get well? There are some questions that you never ask, aren't there? Never ask a football manager if he's going to win the next match that his team are going to play, even if it's against Norwich City. Because a football manager will always say, well, you know, there are no easy games in football. It's a game of two halves. The opponent are better than their record, and so on and so on. He'll never say, yes, of course we're going to win our next match. So people never ask that question. There are some people, don't look at them if you know anyone like this, but there are some people to whom you never ask the question, are you all right? Because you get the answer, and you're stuck there for 15 minutes while they tell you all the reasons that they're not all right. So you learn not to ask them. My tongue is slightly in my cheek. Jesus' question is so ridiculous that even William Booth College don't bother to teach you not to ask it when you go on a hospital visit. Do you want to get well? What a question. Do you want to get well? Of course he wants to get well. But maybe it's not such a ridiculous question. We have to think about what the consequences were for this man if he said yes in answer to that question. This was pretty much all that he knew in life. This was the only way that he could earn a living at the moment, was to go along to the pool of Bethesda and beg for money from those who were passing by. He would have lost his living. He would have had to find another way to make a living. If he was healed, he'd have to get up and work like everyone else. So maybe Jesus is right in saying, do you want to get well? Do you really want to get well? And if it's right for Jesus to ask the lame man that question, then it's right to allow him to ask that question of us this morning. Do we want to get well? Do we want to be transformed? Some of you may have already heard some of this message and thought, well, this is not me. I'm emotionally mature, thank you very much. I haven't got any problems in my life. My emotions are fine. Do you want to be well? Your answer may well be no. You're already well enough. Many of us, like me, will nod our head and say, yes, of course we do. Of course we want to be well. But then nothing ever happens. Or we try for a bit, and a bit like our New Year's resolutions, we fail and we cut it back a bit, and then we try again and we fail again and we cut it back a bit. And eventually the old broken patterns in our life continue. We may say to Jesus, yes, we want to be changed, we want to be healed, but in our hearts of hearts, we don't. And I understand that. It is hard. It is hard to deal with some of the things that I've mentioned this morning, and sometimes I even wonder if it's impossible. But it can't be impossible, because Jesus continues to ask us, do you want to be well? Do you want to be well? He wouldn't ask us that question if he didn't have the power to make us well. But we have our work to do too. Once the lame man had answered that question, yes, of course I want to be made well, then Jesus says, well, you've got work to do then. Jesus told him to take up his mat and walk. Now that must have been hard. Having not walked for 38 years, it must have been hard to get on his feet and pick up his mat and begin to walk. And if we want to change, then it might be hard, but in the power of the Holy Spirit, we will have to work hard to dig beneath the surface. How can we tell if we want to be, how can we tell if we need to be made well? Well, there are lots of different ways. We can ask other people. They're usually pretty good at working out whether we need to be made well or not. We can ask our body. What might our body be telling us about our feelings? Are there those occasions when we feel a knot in our stomach? Are there those times when we suffer from a tension headache? Are we one of those people who grinds our teeth when we go to sleep? Are there times when we're in a situation when we feel that our hands are clenched and we've got sweaty palms, or we have a tight neck? We can feel the tension in our body. Or maybe we're sitting somewhere doing nothing, except our body is doing something. Maybe our foot is tapping. Maybe you're one of those people, I used to be one of these people, I don't do it quite so much now, who can't leave things on a table alone when you're doing nothing. Anybody tear up like the sugar packets, all that kind of stuff? Maybe that was just me. Oh no, Ian as well. Yeah? Maybe a sign of tension. Or insomnia. That's another sign. You need to take time to be able to do that. You need to take time to slow down and to listen to your body and what it might be telling you. And ask God to show you and to interpret it for you. Along with God, you might need to ask yourself some difficult questions. These are difficult why questions that I quite often ask myself. Why am I always in a hurry? Why am I so impatient? Why am I so anxious? Why do I need others to tell me that I'm doing all right? Why do I dread meeting whichever person it is? Why do I avoid confrontation? God can help us with the answers to those questions, and we begin to see where Jesus may need to make us well. It may be that you're already asking yourself some of those questions, and your answer is, I don't want to be made well, thank you very much. Now I realize where some of the problems might lie. Not if it involves me doing any work. But just remember, in the middle of that sea of suffering humanity, hundreds of people who needed to be healed, Jesus was there in their midst, around that distressing scene at the pool of Bethesda. And he's with us too, as we seek the healing we need in our lives. As you dig beneath the surface, I can promise you, you often find out just how sinful and flawed you are. But Jesus says to you, no matter that, you are more accepted and more loved than you will ever know. And that's exactly the reason that Jesus asks you, do you want to be made well? Because he loves and he accepts you as you are, but he doesn't want to leave you where you are. So, do you want to get well? If you do, then I invite you to take this journey with me, because I'm taking it with you as we lead a healthy lifestyle over the next few weeks, as we invite Jesus to heal and transform us, because he has the power to do it. That's why he asks us, do you want to be made well? In the silence, as we listen to General Albert Osborne's words, we allow God's healing waters to flow over us and begin to make us well. And as we listen, there is opportunity to respond this morning, to use the place of prayer if you wish to do so. We'll listen just now to Healing Waters.